This is the Jeff McLeod Show, where we talk about God, America, the things that make our country great, and so much more. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Jeff McLeod Show. I hope you had a great Monday, and I'm hoping you're having a great Tuesday so far. Unfortunately, last night there was an escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war and the rhetoric between the United States and Russia, so we're going to discuss that today, as well as a few other topics. So let's begin. So yesterday marked a dramatic shift in the Russia-Ukraine war. Yesterday, the United States, specifically President Donald Trump, said that he was willing to allow Ukraine to strike within the heart of Russia using American-made weapons. He even said that they could use our Tomahawk missiles potentially in the future, which have about a 1,500-mile range, so Ukraine would be able to shoot from Kiev all the way into Moscow. And that is one thing that I do not agree with. We're going to talk about how this war was preventable to begin with and what we should do to stop it and stop prolonging this war further. So let's get down to the numbers. So most people just look at a war and they choose to take sides without looking into the details and about how harmful it is just with the loss of human life. So over 77,403 Ukrainian military deaths have occurred so far. That's not including the wounded. That's not including people who are out of service and unable to fight anymore. So that's an extremely high number. And it's estimated, of course, Russia doesn't give an accurate number or estimation of how many individuals died on their side, but up to 250,000 Russian military deaths, plus 14,116 civilian deaths, which leads to roughly a 341,500 death military and civilian total. So there are some estimates that have this number over 400,000 individuals. This number specifically would be some of the highest fatality rates since World War II. So this war has to stop. I want to say it clearly. I believe Russia was the aggressor. However, I don't believe Ukraine either is completely innocent. I don't believe there's some great country and they're for protecting freedom. I really don't. They're not freedom bearers like Zelensky wants everyone to believe. But I do believe the Ukrainian people deserve better, and I believe the Russian people deserve better. And I also believe this war was started by Russia. It began when Russia first invaded the Crimean area of Ukraine, and President Putin at the time said that it was largely a Russian area with many Russian speakers. Does it sound like something out of the old playbook? That was something Hitler said about Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland. He said most of those individuals were German speakers, so therefore they should take that country over because there were more Germans there than native speakers, and they identified more with Germany. Putin played the same thing out of the handbook. He said more people in Crimea were Russian and that the Ukrainians were violating their rights. They weren't able to vote like normal Ukrainians, so therefore Russia should take it over. And President Obama did absolutely nothing to stop it. He didn't leverage anything. They didn't put major sanctions on Russia. They put small sanctions. It could have been worse. And Russia and the rest of Europe continued to perpetuate this. And over time, Putin chose another strategic time to attack in 2021, one of those 2 years. He decided that he was going to invade Ukraine, and we've been in a war ever since. So let's talk about a few ways this war was preventable. Number one, Putin has invaded under democratic U.S. leadership. I don't want to put all the blame on U.S. leadership because ultimately it's a Russian leader invading Ukrainian territory. It's not like they invaded the United States. However, the U.S. is one of the strongest, if not the strongest country in the world. So therefore, we have a lot of leveraging power. And Donald Trump has done a good job, I would say, leveraging for the most part, trying to keep Putin at bay. And I'm going to talk about a few different policies that were changed, especially under the Biden administration. So going back all the way into the 1990s, Bill Clinton came together with the Soviet Union and Ukraine, and they all signed a deal. And the deal basically stated that if Ukraine's rights were invaded, it denuclearized Ukraine, And if basically, if Ukraine was under a threat from Russia, the U.S. was supposed to intervene. This was all signed in the 1990s under Bill Clinton. Once again, another Democratic president. So President Obama, he didn't back it up. He didn't come and support Ukraine. And President Biden didn't. And we're left with a mess that President Trump has to try cleaning up, and so far has been unable to clean up. It's just been something that it's been a mess for the whole entire world. And I want to say as well that this would not have happened if the European nations didn't put such a small portion of their budget into military defense. Their budget should have been way up here in military defense. So let's real quick look at the population of Europe versus the population of the United States. So I did something to be fair. Not every European nation is in NATO. Okay, we'll talk about NATO more in a little bit. And also, some European countries that are in NATO, such as Turkey, are major allies of Russia. So there are NATO members also buying fuel from Russia. So approximately 532.5 million people, if you include Ukraine, because they would be involved in this war, are NATO members. So that's the population of all the countries combined that are NATO members in Europe, plus the population of Ukraine. This does not include the population of the United States. And I'm getting somewhere with this. So the U.S. has largely supported NATO down through the years. We've supported most of its budget. We pay the most into it, when in reality, we face the lowest threat. Right? Russia is not on our back door. It's next to Alaska, but that's the unpopulated portion of eastern Russia. And we don't face the imminent threat of an invasion from Moscow. The closest threat that we've ever had was Cuba, when during the Soviet Union in the 1960s, that under the Bay of Pigs, that they would basically, there was a threat of a nuclear invasion from Russian submarines. So that was the only major threat that we had, and it was something that was preventable because Russia had to send an entire fleet and some of their ships all the way to Cuba to be able to get to us, and that's what they still have to do. So they're at a major disadvantage if they want to get to Washington, D.C. or attack our heartland, even with hypersonic missiles. Hypersonic missiles would take a good amount of time to be able to get here from Russia, from Moscow. It would take somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes. And in that period of time, I believe we'd be able to shoot down the ballistic missiles or hypersonic missiles that were sent from Russia. So I'm just setting up a background that the United States, we basically put in the most to NATO and we receive the least out of it. If we were ever invaded, we would be providing most of the military support. We give most of the military support to NATO. So most of our troops are going to be the peacekeeping troops. You can go back into the war on terror. Article 5 of NATO was declared, which basically triggers all NATO nations are in a war against a common enemy and against a common threat. So during the war on terror, Article 5 was initiated. Who provided most of the troops? The United States. After that, there's countries like Britain and France that provide soldiers and manpower as well. But we provided the majority of the manpower, and we still do to NATO. So President Trump wanted that to change, and he wanted each of these countries to put about 5% of their annual GDP into NATO. So he wanted them to raise it from about 2.5% to 5% because he said they should be holding their own weight in NATO, and I agree. The U.S. shouldn't support NATO. These countries that are under imminent threat of a Russian invasion, they're the ones that should support NATO the most, i.e. Poland, which is right on their border, and some of the Baltic states. Those areas, they need the support. So their GDP, the percentage of their GDP should be even higher. Maybe they should be putting 10% into NATO because of the imminent threat. Romania, Bulgaria, all those countries in the Eastern European former Soviet bloc, they're the ones that need to be in the highest alert because President Putin has stated that the worst day in history was when the Soviet Union fell. So I do believe that in time, his dream plan would be able to get the Eastern European bloc back under Soviet control. So those areas specifically should be providing the highest percentage of their GDP to NATO, followed by the Central European countries such as Germany and you can go down. I know Switzerland's neutral. You can go to Italy, and then it should basically decrease the further west you go because there's less of a threat. However, Britain still and France are much closer to Russia and to Moscow than we are, so they should be putting a large percentage in of their annual GDP. And I understand that America, we produce the most money in the world. We have the largest GDP in the entire world. So when we put 5% in, or whatever percent we're putting in right now, we're putting in still the majority of the swath of military support for NATO. So Europe right now, they need to bolster their defenses. They need to make sure that their armies are in good fighting shape, that they have appropriate weapons, and that they're keeping up with the technology of the time to be able to deter a Russian threat, because ultimately that will be the only thing that stops Vladimir Putin, is when he sees that basically there is sufficient military force to defeat him, as well as the potential ally of China, okay, and India potentially, and Iran. That's a lot of population in those three countries. So Europe, as well as the rest of the NATO nations, we have to make sure that we're keeping up with the technology of some of the Eastern countries, because they certainly are wanting to increase their power and increase their worldwide influence. So here's some other issues right now that European nations have, and this has perpetuated the war between Russia and Ukraine. And honestly, it's a tragedy. What's been happening is Russia has been pulling all their interest into this war. They've been even using North Korean soldiers, and then we're giving money and to Ukraine to fight this war. And what's happening is you're having massive bloodshed, and you're having many people die. When the stupidity of all of it is, Europe for a while, not as much anymore, but for a while, was still buying their oil from Russia. So what they were doing is they were giving money to Russia to finance the Russian side of the war, and they were also giving money to Ukraine to finance the Ukrainian side of the war. So what they're doing is they're causing this war never to end. So that needed to stop, and President Trump has been pushing for the European Union and for NATO to cut off funding further and oil exports further from Russia. And they've been doing a pretty good job at that. So let's look at the different countries right now that are continuing to buy Russian oil. Some of them are no surprise. So China by far is the greatest buyer of Russian crude exports. So in 2025, China accounted for 47% of Russia's crude exports. That's from IEA, and there's several other sources, and you can look that up. India is the second largest buyer, taking about 38% of Russia's crude exports. So if we're just doing the math, that's about 85% of Russia's total oil is being bought from China and India. So President Trump mentioned that, or that's the crude oil, excuse me. So there's natural gas. Many of these countries are buying from Russia, and that's also a problem. It is financing the war. So 38% of Russia's crude exports come from India in the months, and 47% come from China. Much of the rest is purchased from Turkey, and then a small percentage is still purchased from the European Union. So that's shrinking. That was close to 50% in 2020. So what happened, President Trump smartly in his first term, he canceled the construction of the Nordic 2 Stream pipeline, which was basically a pipeline that ran under the Baltic Sea, and it gave Germany oil from Russia and natural gas. It was mostly a natural gas line, and it fed most of Northern Europe with Russian exports, or imports, excuse me. So what happened is these countries, President Trump warned against this during his first term, because he realized if Russia was able to get a stranglehold on the natural gas supply in Europe, he was going to be able to own Europe, because he would be able to build his coffers to be able to finance a war. And sure enough, that happened. And he used Iran as an ally as well. He bought many of the drones that he purchased were from Iran, and that's why you have an issue with Israel and Iran. Russia and Iran now are interconnected. Their economies are, because they buy weapons off of each other. So they're interconnected. China wants to invade Taiwan, and certainly the rest of the free world is not going to condone that. Russia would, right? And so would North Korea, but most of the rest of the world won't. So what we've created And what specifically President Biden and the Democratic leadership created during this time was this power vacuum. And what happened is you created, because Russia was isolated from the rest of the world, you created this power vacuum where Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran all got together. And they formed this alliance and they purchased off of each other. So right now, I'm curious how President Trump is going to do this. He's calling on China and India to cut down their Russian oil imports, which I don't see them doing unless there's some sort of major sanction, especially China, because China is right now gearing up, I believe, to at some point invade Taiwan. So that's something that we have to keep an eye on, and it would be in our best interest to somehow be able to isolate Russia without isolating China and India. So if you could isolate Russia by itself, you could shut off the money supply coming in, and eventually they wouldn't be able to build any more weapons. But that's much easier said than done, considering China and Russia are already interconnected and their economies are so close together. They've been close together since China became communist in the 1940s. At that point, though, Mao did not get along with Joseph Stalin, and then later on Gorbachev, and not Gorbachev, Nikita Khrushchev, and they were kind of separated, but they still had the bond of both being communist countries. So they've had a little bit of this interconnectivity for the last 70 plus years or so. So it will be hard to break them, especially when we've drawn them closer over the last 5 years or so, because we've isolated them against the rest of the world. So we have to cut down the supply. And here is the hypocrisy. I'm going to read your top 10. I've already gone over the top 3, China, India, and Turkey. Turkey, by the way, I believe should be expelled as a NATO member, because Turkey has one of the largest armies. It's against Israel, and it also buys a large amount of their oil and their natural gas from Russia. About 26% of their imports are Russian oil or Russian natural gas, which is an incredibly high number for a NATO country. And we can see the flaws in NATO. NATO was designed to help deter war, when in reality, it's accepted so many nations that some of the nations have conflicting interests. And when nations have conflicting interests and they're quote unquote buying from the enemy, so all of a sudden they're not an ally of NATO, even though they're a NATO member. They're an ally of the enemy, Russia. So President Trump started with negotiations. He was clearly being played, and that's something that the Democrats could say, because they were saying what we need to do is we need to make sure that we isolate Russia, and we put tariffs on Russia, and we limit the exportation and importation of oil from Russia to European countries. So, however, they also perpetuated this war by allowing that pipeline to get built, and not vetoing it and not saying this shouldn't be built. So they're also partly responsible. So China, India, and Turkey are the top 3. Then there's Brazil. So Brazil is right now, their leadership certainly is not an ally to freedom. Next, it's Saudi Arabia for oil. Then it's Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. Okay, all NATO members. So you have NATO members buying a large supply, I'm assuming, I don't have it marked right here, of their natural gas from Russia. It's completely unacceptable. And these are the same countries, France, for instance, that is selling much of their military equipment to Ukraine. So they're perpetuating and continuing this bloodshed in this war, because they're funding both sides of the war. After that, it's Spain and Slovakia, 2 more NATO members. NATO members need to completely cut it off. Or it's either one or the other, or buy from Russia and make Russia feel that they're not up against a wall. But then you run into the question, how do you help Ukraine? And that's a conundrum. So next, let's go and talk about NATO. So, and understand it a little better. So NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which basically created a treaty between European countries as well as the North Atlantic countries. So Canada, the U.S., not sure if Mexico is part of that. I believe they are. And it created this giant, giant treaty that was supposed to be an anti-war treaty. We know how all of these have gone throughout world history. All of them have been broken, right? The UN certainly has not done its job as it was supposed to keep peace. We've had many wars since the UN was established. since NATO was founded in, I believe it was 1946, we have had many wars as well. Not as many, I will say, with these blocks of countries: Canada, the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Poland, to name a few. But there have been some conflicts in those areas. So here's the big one. And this is why I think we could have a world war. So with Donald Trump's change in position, policy position, he is basically stating that he is going, what he wants to do is he wants to speak softly and carry a big stick, as Theodore Roosevelt said, except he's going to not speak softly. He's just going to speak loudly and carry a big stick. The one thing I think he fails to realize is Putin is his match. So many people around the world are fearful of President Trump, and rightfully so, because he is a man of his word and he will back up what he says many times. Okay. However, at the same time, President Putin is not going to just capitulate. He is Donald Trump's match. There aren't many strong world leaders right now. President Xi in China is a strong leader. President Trump is a strong leader. And Vladimir Putin is a strong leader. Or around the rest of the world, you have some other ones that are in some poor countries right now. There's some strong, I think of Malay. There's some strong leaders around the world, but those are the three biggest. And I know Donald Trump will back up his talk. I know President Putin will. So you've run into a conundrum. President Trump believes that now, because President Putin played him, that what he has to do is he has to play tough guy. And it works a lot of times in the United States and around the world when you're dealing with sane leaders who don't want sanctions, who don't want to have a tariff placed against them, who want to have trade with the rest of the world. Clearly, President Putin, does not care. He doesn't care. So I don't even know if this will do anything. What you might end up doing is you might end up triggering World War III, legitimately. So if President Trump allows our Tomahawk missiles to be, we give it to Ukraine, they purchase it off of us, and they fire them at Moscow, Moscow will retaliate. Will they retaliate against the United States directly? I doubt it, because it's such a far distance. Will they tolerate by launching some sort of nuclear weapon against Ukraine or Poland? I don't know. That's something that could be discussed, and it could very well happen. So there aren't very many good scenarios if Donald Trump indeed lets Ukraine use our weapons, and it escalates to the point, which I could see it, of using a Tomahawk missile system. Those are highly lethal weapons. Russia does have very, very good nuclear capability. Russia and the United States by a mile have the largest nuclear stockpile in the entire world. So Russia and the United States could blow up the entire world many times just with their nuclear weapons alone. So China has a good number of nuclear weapons too, but not to the same, anywhere close to the same degree as the United States and Russia. So Russia could respond by firing nuclear weapons into Ukraine. They could decide to continue sending drones over NATO territory, such as Poland and Hungary and Romania and some of the Baltic states, maybe Finland, which I believe recently became a NATO member. So there are a number of ways that Russia could respond. Russia could respond by an all-out invasion of Poland. I think they would be very stupid to do that. And as a Bible believer, I actually think they're going to move south. I don't think they're going to move north. I think they're going to maybe attack Romania or Bulgaria next, would be my opinion, because they're weaker. They don't have as much resistance. And then I believe that Turkey will break their contract with NATO and align with Russia. That's my gut feeling in all of this. And you have a major problem on your hands, because Turkey has over 100 million people. They have a 1 million-man army. Turkey has one of the strongest armies in the world. Most people don't know that. So Russia linking with Turkey would be a dramatic boon for Russia's morale, and it would also allow Turkey to feel like they're going to usher back in the Ottoman Empire. So you have these two nations. You have Russia as well as Turkey trying to restore their empire and to restore their manifest destiny. And then they have an ally in Iran, along the way that it was just humiliated. So it's just a bad scenario either way you look at it. Then you have China that wants to expand their empire in acquiring Taiwan and probably more. And India right now is clearly buying from Russia. So I don't even know what side India is on. Between all those countries, I'm just doing a rough estimate in my head. You have almost at 40% of the world's population just there. If you include the United States and you include Europe and you include Mexico and much of the rest of the free world that would actually get involved in fight, it's about equivalent manpower. Or the allies, the United States, England, France, Germany, Mexico, Canada, we might be outnumbered in that scenario. So it's a bad scenario because Vladimir Putin is not a good man. He doesn't mind. Something that we mind in the West is losing soldiers. We hate it. That's why we lost the Vietnam War. That's why Korea was a stalemate. And that's why right now Israel is receiving bad press in Gaza. It's because people are dying and the press shows everything like it's terrible. And all of a sudden we lose morale. So Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, India, I don't know about India as much to be fair, but at least China, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, they're not going to care about how many men they lose. I promise you that. They're not going to be having transgender people in the army. I guarantee you that. They're not going to be having these weak, soy boys that are in the military that weigh 110 pounds. I promise you that. Okay. Now I'm starting to think of the people that are the Chinese people and how tall they normally are, but they're going to be tough. I guarantee you. So this could be shaping up for a world war. I hope not. That would be utter travesty, but it could be if President Trump plays his cards wrong, and the world right now and the world leaders play their cards wrong. So let's look at Article 5 of NATO. If a NATO member is attacked, all members treat it as an attack on themselves. So that means automatically it triggers a response, depending on what the NATO, if one NATO country declares war on the opposing side, all the NATO members, I believe, have to declare war. It triggers a response. Each member agrees to take action it deems necessary, which may include the use of armed force. And a lot of times today's wars are not fought with armed military, but they're fought with drones, drone warfare, ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, and we're very much in this techie age of modern warfare. So there's going to be a higher rate of fatalities. However, things can be more precise, but countries like Russia, they don't care about precision. They just want people to lose their morale. Think about Hitler when he launched an attack on England during World War II. What he really did is he attacked civilian centers because he wanted the civilian to lose their morale, and he thought if they lost their morale, they would lose the war. Thankfully, they didn't lose their morale. So Russia is going to attack civilian centers because he wants those nations to slowly lose their morale and give in and capitulate to Russian demands. So if NATO members attacked, all members are under attack. Here's some key points. It's not an automatic war, but automatic consultation and solidarity. All these nations have to come together for a meeting. Each member chooses its own response. So military, economic, etc. And it's been invoked only once, and it's after 9/11, as I mentioned, the attack on the U.S. So right now, if Russia launched a missile into Poland or Lithuania, it would trigger Article 5, A cyber attack causing massive destruction from Russia or Iran or China, that would trigger Article 5, depending on the interpretation. And then a naval attack on NATO ships in the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, any of these areas would also invoke Article 5 of NATO. So here's some other articles that are less commonly discussed. Article 4 is the consultation clause. So the parties will consult together whenever the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. So if Poland was invaded, or drones are coming into their country, for instance, it would require a massive consultation because you can see that Russia is ramping up for something bigger. It's invoked by Poland after Russian missiles landed near its border recently. So Article 4 has already been invoked, and invoked by Turkey several times during the Syrian civil war and conflict. Okay, now we're looking at Article 3. Article 3, parties will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. It obliges members to build strong defenses. This was neglected for a long time. Like, I wonder why there weren't like walls or fortresses built between Eastern Europe and Russia after the Soviet bloc's collapse. I don't know. It's not a war trigger, but a foundation for readiness and deterrence. And the main reason that a lot of times nations are not concerned with war is they want to be able to build their colleges, their universities, their economies, their agriculture sector, and their technological sector, and they don't want to focus on the military. But when you don't focus on the military, another country will take advantage and exploit it. And you see that with Russia, and you're going to see that pretty soon. I'm calling on this with North Korea and South Korea. You're going to see it with China and Taiwan. And hopefully all these countries start building their defenses up and they start increasing their technology, because we don't have the manpower alone to beat these other nations if a war was started. So, and then let's look at Article 6 lastly. The territory of any member in Europe or North America, this includes islands under their jurisdiction in the North Atlantic, and forces, vessels, or aircraft in the Mediterranean or North Atlantic. So it involves pretty much everything in the Northern Hemisphere as long as those nations accepted to be part of NATO and joined it. So now I'm going to give you some of my opinion on this whole entire issue and what I would do to stop it if I think it could be stopped, and as an American, what I would do. So largely, if you ask me, are you someone that's an isolationist or are you someone that is an interventionist? I would say I'm somewhere in the middle. I would say I lean isolationist. So I believe we should protect worldwide what is in America's interest. And people mention Israel, people talk about Ukraine. Here's my stance on both. Okay, Ukraine was attacked by Russia. However, Ukraine is not, for me, a strategic point in the world, and it's not a nation necessarily that has our values that we should support. They don't give us weapons. There's no benefit for us individually. That's why I'm glad President Trump signed a deal with them where they were going to give us some money and pay us back for the amount of weapons that we gave them. So I'm kind of for that. And what that allows is that allows for Ukraine to have some form of security, because they know if Russia gains Ukrainian territory, the U.S. we're losing part of our interest in Ukraine. So that was a smart move on their part and on the U.S.'s part. So I am for staying out of Ukraine. I believe Ukraine is Europe's problem. Like I mentioned already, Russia is not knocking on our back door. Russia would have a very difficult time invading the United States through Alaska. Very, very, very difficult. And they would have a hard time sailing. They don't have a great navy, sailing their forces to Cuba to launch some sort of invasion. It would be repelled pretty quickly, I believe. So I don't believe Russia is as great of a threat as we think it is. Okay, and I also don't think Ukraine is as great of an ally as we think Ukraine is. So I believe I would continue maybe giving to NATO, but I would not tell Russia that we are potentially going to give some of our Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, because Russia today said, and there is truth behind this, we know Ukrainians aren't shooting it because they're not trained to shoot those types of missiles. It's going to be the Americans shooting it. So that might involve us in the conflict and they might declare war on us. I would not do that. So what I would do is I would continue with economic pressure and tariffs. It's hard because you don't want to isolate China and India from the United States. So I would buy off of China and India in a way where they believe that we were still good trade partners with them, maybe make a deal with those countries. And as part of the deal, what you do is you tell them they have to cut off a certain percentage of their oil from Russia, and in exchange, the United States will give them that portion of oil that they lost. We will sell it to them. And as a result, what that does is that breaks the alliance a bit from China and India with Russia, and it isolates Russia a little bit more, and it cuts off more of Russia's revenue stream. I would also tell the European nations, stop funding this war and stop putting money into both sides. So I know it's a lot less than it used to be, but money is going into the Russian side from France, from the Netherlands and Belgium and those areas. They need to start relying more on the United States, maybe pay a little bit more if you really believe in the Ukrainian side of the conflict, and they need to cut off their imports from Russia completely. And what this will do is it will isolate Russia. So Trump needs to put some sort of tariff back on, or try going to China or India and making some sort of trade deal. I would deal with India first because I believe they're easier to deal with. And I believe they are going to be a rising country that in 25 years, we're going to be talking about like we're talking about China right now. They're going to be a major world player. Make a deal with them. You don't want them becoming your enemies. I would then try focusing on China and breaking the support between the two countries by giving a deal. Maybe it's some sort of, I wouldn't do an arms deal. Maybe it's an automotive deal. Maybe it's some sort of manufacturing deal that you make with China, and you're able to do that, and they have to buy oil off of you in exchange during the deal. So Donald Trump is known for writing the book, The Art of the Deal, and I believe a deal needs to be made, and it can be made without involving President Putin. So if that does so, I would largely view that we should stay out of this conflict and not put money into it. Now, where do I stand as far as Israel? So as a Christian, I believe the Jews are God's chosen people. Is the Jewish government always correct? No. And I believe a lot of times they want us to go to war for their interest, as we will want another country to come to our aid for our interest, right? If we knew of another country that had superior technology. I am for Israel's defense because I do believe they're a democracy. They were attacked. I want to make that abundantly clear. Hamas was the aggressor, and Israel is doing a righteous thing right now and trying to remove the aggressors, and they're trying to end this war. I actually think Netanyahu should have attacked stronger in the beginning and stopped catering to the left in Israel and the left around the world, and fewer people would have died and this war would not have been prolonged. So that's my take. Hopefully the deal today that President Trump gave to Hamas, hopefully they accept. If they don't accept, and believe me, there's been deal after deal after deal after deal that have been proposed, and Hamas never accepts it. So they are the ones that are putting the burden on the Palestinians. It's not Israel. It's not the rest of the world. It's purely Hamas. But ultimately, the Palestinians voted for Hamas to be in power. So I am for financing Israel's defense. I am not for financing Israel's foreign wars. And Israel certainly is not perfect. As a Christian, I'll make this stance completely clear. I believe that we don't have to always support the government of Israel, but God did promise Israel a certain swath of land. And ultimately in the Bible, in the millennial reign, it's going to be from the Euphrates River to the all the way to the Nile. And the key word is the millennial reign. That most of the Jews don't understand that right now. And they probably think of a manifest destiny where they're going to grow. It's not their time yet. So I'm not for their territorial expansion currently. But so it's not wrong to critique them. However, God wants to preserve his people, and they will be around in the future. So I believe in preserving the Jewish race and their land. However, I don't always support their public decisions, and I believe what's best for America. So around the world right now, I believe we need to be bolstering the defense of nations that are under threat. Okay, so Taiwan right now, and help them out so it deters war, actually, because defense deters war, and offense, having a capable military, deters war. And I'm for, right now, the war is too far in right now for it to end between Russia and Ukraine. I'm for trying to make a deal with India and China that would cut off their oil imports from Russia. So that would be my solution. And a message to President Trump, and if you're listening, we voted you in because we are tired of the neocons. We don't want wars around the world. We're not trying to set up democracy around the world. And our biggest concern should be United States citizens. The cost of groceries is through the roof. Homelessness is through the roof. People aren't able to buy houses anymore that are my age. I don't have one right now because they're so expensive. The price of cars has risen. And Mr. President, I am a conservative, and I believe in much that you're doing. I agree with a lot of it, and I agree with many of the social issues. But focus on our country first before you focus on giving a foreign country weapons. Show your strength in the Western Hemisphere, and I believe that's sufficient. And build allies up here. Russia isn't a direct threat to us. And be wise. And ultimately, as a Christian, now back to us, we should be praying for our leaders. The Bible says for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. And for this is peaceable, right? We want peace. In order for there to be peace, we need to pray for our leaders that God would give them real wisdom. We don't have all the answers. And there are a lot of people in President Trump's ear. There are a lot of people in the ears of the leaders around the world. We have to be praying that they make the right decision for our country and for peace, so that we don't have another world war, because I'm afraid that we could be on the dawn of a new war.